Nobody wants to hear anything from your new album.
Mick Jagger has been one of rock and roll's most famous performers for more than 60 years. He moves across the stage with incredible energy, but there's always been something more thoughtful beneath all that showmanship. Behind the famous strut, the distinctive voice, and the larger-than-life personality, there's a careful student of music who has never stopped listening and learning. Mick didn't create rock and roll from nothing. Instead, he soaked it up like a sponge. He learned from the blues musicians, the poets, and the rebels who came before him. He studied their records as if they were precious books, borrowed their passion, and transformed it into something that was uniquely his own. Throughout his entire career, he has remained a genuine fan of music, not just his own success, but of all the sounds that helped shape him into who he became. There are 7 albums that were especially important to Mick's development as an artist. These weren't just records he enjoyed listening to, they were like teachers to him. Each one carved out a piece of his artistic soul, influenced his singing voice, and sharpened his instincts about what made great music. These albums ranged from the raw, powerful energy of Chicago blues to the sharp rebellion of punk rock. They whispered truths to him that even the biggest stadium concerts could never fully express. While Mick Jagger became a global icon, these albums helped keep him grounded and human. Here are the 7 rock albums that Mick considered essential and the deeper reasons why they mattered so much to him. Before Mick Jagger became a star, there was Chuck Berry. Without Chuck Berry's influence, the Rolling Stones might never have existed at all. When Chuck Berry released his album in 1957, it wasn't just another record. It was a complete blueprint for what rock and roll could be. Chuck Berry did something nobody else had managed to do before. He made the guitar tell complete stories. He took 3 simple chords and turned them into poetry. He sang about everyday teenage life, about cars and girls and rebellion against authority, but underneath those seemingly simple topics, he was actually documenting an entire generation that was waking up and demanding to be heard. When Mick heard Chuck Berry's music, everything changed for him. He was just a young kid in Dartford, England, dreaming small dreams. Then Chuck Berry's voice came through the radio like a bolt of lightning, and nothing was ever the same. It wasn't just the sound of the music that affected Mick. It was the attitude behind it, the confidence, the way Chuck owned every single note without ever apologizing for who he was. Mick once said that Chuck taught him that rock and roll wasn't about being perfect. It was about being present and real in the moment. That lesson stayed with Mick for his entire career. Songs like the ones on that album weren't polished and smooth. They were alive and raw. The guitar riffs were sharp and clean, cutting through everything else. The lyrics moved fast and were packed with clever details and wit. Chuck Berry didn't waste a single word. He wrote like someone who knew that time was short and stories were important. Mick absorbed that economy of language, that sharpness, and that absolute refusal to bore anyone listening. Chuck Berry was also an amazing showman. He invented his famous duck walk dance move. He grinned in the face of danger. He made performing look like the purest form of freedom. Mick watched all of this carefully and learned, not to copy Chuck, but to understand what he was doing. Rock and roll wasn't just about the sound coming from the speakers, it was a movement, a form of theater. Chuck Berry was the first actor on a stage that would continue forever. Another album that Mick considered sacred was released in 1968, and it was important because it wasn't perfect, but because it was dangerous and daring. This was when Muddy Waters, the absolute king of Chicago blues, went electric in ways that shocked the traditional blues fans. He added fuzz effects, feedback, and psychedelic edges to his classic blues sound. Some people hated what he did, but Mick loved it. He called it the sound of the blues refusing to die quietly and refusing to be pushed aside. The Rolling Stones actually took their band name from a Muddy Waters song. That single fact tells you everything you need to know about how important Muddy was to them. He was the foundation, the bedrock, of everything they built. Without Muddy Waters, there would be no British blues invasion, no Rolling Stones, no Led Zeppelin, no Cream. Just silence where there should have been thunder. Mick understood that debt deeply,
and never forgot it for a moment. Muddy's electric album was controversial because it refused to be nostalgic. Muddy didn't try to preserve the past exactly as it had been. He grabbed it and dragged it into the present, kicking and screaming all the way. The guitars were loud and heavily distorted. The rhythms were hypnotic and heavy. It sounded like someone had literally set the blues on fire. For Mick, who had just released one of the Stones' important albums around that same time, this fearlessness mattered enormously. Here was Muddy Waters in his 50s, still taking huge risks, still evolving and growing. The album featured new versions of songs that had been around for years, but here they felt completely reborn, rougher and rawer than ever. It proved that tradition didn't have to mean staying frozen in place. Tradition could mean survival and growth. Mick understood from this that you could honor and respect the past without living entirely in it. You could respect the blues deeply and still make it scream with new energy. The Beatles were never really enemies of the Rolling Stones. They were more like mirrors, reflecting each other's ambitions back and forth. When the Beatles released their groundbreaking album in 1966, they were no longer just a simple pop band. They had transformed into architects of sound itself. Mick, who was competitive to his very core, paid close attention. He didn't resent the Beatles' genius. Instead, he respected it deeply. And for Mick, respect always meant one thing above all else. You had to raise your own game. This Beatles album was a major turning point. The band stopped trying to chase what the crowd wanted and started chasing the impossible instead. They took enormous risks with every song. Some tracks had no guitars at all. Others sounded like prayers from another dimension. Every single song took a creative risk. Mick once said that the Beatles made everyone else look lazy, and that was actually good for the entire music world. The Stones and the Beatles pushed each other forward without ever directly saying so. When the Beatles released one innovative album, the Stones would answer with their own. When the Beatles proved that rock could be considered art, the Stones sharpened their edge even more. They weren't copying each other, they were competing and inspiring each other. What Mick admired most about this Beatles album was the complete fearlessness. The Beatles were already the biggest band in the entire world, and they still chose to experiment. They still reached for something new and uncertain. The album was proof that success didn't have to mean playing it safe. Success actually meant having the freedom to fail. For Mick, that was perhaps the greatest lesson of all. Don't give your audience exactly what they expect from you. Give them something they didn't even know they needed. There was a live album released in 1963 that Mick considered almost like a religious sermon. It wasn't just a concert recording, it was more like a religious experience that had somehow been captured on vinyl. The performer didn't just sing and dance, he seemed possessed by something larger than himself. Mick already had natural rhythm and charisma, but this performer had something else entirely. He had iron discipline, precision, and control that was disguised to look like pure chaos. Every single move was carefully rehearsed, every scream was calculated and planned, and yet somehow it all felt like spontaneous combustion happening right in front of your eyes. Mick studied this paradox carefully. He learned that truly great performance wasn't actually wild and random, it was surgical and precise. It was knowing exactly when to explode with energy and when to hold back and create tension.
The live album opened with an introduction that felt like a coronation ceremony. The crowd was already screaming wildly before the performer even appeared on stage, and when he finally did appear, he didn't waste a single second. One song stretched for over 10 minutes. It built up tension, then broke that tension, then built it up again in waves. At one point, the performer collapsed on stage. Someone brought out a cape. He recovered dramatically. The audience completely lost their minds with excitement. Mick watched all of this and thought to himself that this was pure theater at its finest. This performer taught Mick that the stage was sacred ground. You didn't walk onto it casually. You didn't phone in your performance. Every single night had to be treated like it was your last night on Earth. Every show had to be approached as if it was the only show that would ever matter. That incredible work ethic and that relentless commitment became like a religion for Mick. He carried those lessons into every single Rolling Stones concert for the next 60 years of his career. Bob Dylan didn't just write songs, he fundamentally rewired how people thought about music. When his groundbreaking album came out in 1965, rock and roll suddenly had literature embedded right into it. Words mattered just as much as melody and rhythm. For Mick, who had always relied more on swagger and attitude than on deep substance, Dylan represented a serious reckoning. Dylan's album hit like a punch straight to the chest. 6 full minutes of venom mixed with poetry. It wasn't a simple love song, it was more like a eulogy for something that had died. Dylan was angry, cryptic, and utterly untouchable. Mick heard this and realized that the bar for songwriting had been dramatically raised. You couldn't just sing about girls and cars anymore, not after Dylan had shown what was possible. You had to actually mean something with your songs, or at least sound convincingly like you did. Dylan's album was electric in every possible sense of the word. He had gone completely into rock music, and the traditional folk music fans absolutely hated him for making that choice. But Mick understood the tremendous courage that decision took. Dylan simply didn't care about getting everyone's approval. He cared about telling the truth as he saw it. And truth, Mick learned, was far more important than applause and easy praise. The album was messy, surreal, and absolutely brilliant all at once. One song stretched for 11 minutes and somehow never got boring for a single second. That was real power. Dylan never bothered to explain what his lyrics meant. He left them open, wild, and mysterious. Mick admired that absolute refusal to simplify things for people. Rock and roll didn't have to be obvious and straightforward. It could be a puzzle that made you think even while you were dancing. Dylan's album proved that intelligence and rebellion weren't opposite forces. They were actually partners working together. An album released in 1971 showed Mick a different kind of power. It wasn't loud or aggressive, but it was definitely a form of protest. The artist took pain and suffering and wrapped them in pure beauty. He sang about war, poverty, and injustice, but he did it with strings and sweetness. Mick called it the most honest album ever made because it didn't scream at you. Instead, it ached with genuine feeling. The Rolling Stones had always flirted with political topics in their songs, but they did it with edge and danger. This artist did it with soul instead. The album was both gentle and devastating at the exact same time. The title track floated through the air like a question that nobody really wanted to answer. Other songs felt like mourning for everything wrong in the world. One track was basically a prayer for all the broken people. Mick listened carefully and realized that protest music didn't need to be loud to be effective. It just needed to be real and honest. What struck Mick most powerfully was the production of the album. It was lush, layered, and cinematic. Strings swirled around, saxophones cried out. The singer's voice was doubled and tripled, harmonizing with itself. It sounded like a man having a deep conversation with his own soul. That vulnerability, that willingness to be soft in a hard and cruel world, really impressed Mick. He realized that strength wasn't always about volume and aggression. Sometimes true strength was actually about restraint and gentleness. This album proved that rock music and soul music weren't completely separate categories. They were more like siblings in the same family. Both could carry enormous emotional weight. Both could actually change people's minds about important issues. Mick never tried to sound exactly like this artist, but he definitely carried the lesson forward. Music could be beautiful and sweet while still telling difficult truths. The final album that completed Mick's musical education was released in 1979. It was the sound of a brand new generation absolutely refusing to bow down to anyone. Punk rock had arrived on the scene angry and raw, and one band in particular, sharper than all the rest, built something that honored the past while simultaneously kicking down its doors. Mick was in his mid-30s by then and could easily have resented these younger musicians. Instead, he chose to celebrate them. This album wasn't just pure punk, it was everything imaginable, all smashed together. Reggae, rockabilly, ska, soul, all combined with fury and real intelligence. The title track opened like a warning siren going off. The guitars were jagged and sharp. The singer's voice was literally a shout from the streets. But underneath all that chaos was genuine structure and discipline. This band wasn't just angry for the sake of being angry, they were thoughtful and purposeful. Mick respected that combination immensely.
What impressed Mick most about this band was their sheer ambition. They didn't just want to be the biggest band in the world, they wanted to be the most important band, the one that actually mattered. They sang about unemployment, racism, war, and identity. They weren't preaching down to people, they were documenting the reality around them. Some songs were heartbroken and personal, others were about resistance and fighting back. The entire album felt alive, urgent, and absolutely necessary. Mick had spent many decades making people move and dance. This band made people think while they moved. The album reminded Mick exactly why he had started making music in the first place. It wasn't for fame or money. It was for freedom and expression. The band proved that rock and roll wasn't dead at all. It had just changed its shape and form. For Mick, who had been called a relic and out of touch by some critics, this album was living proof that influence wasn't a one-way street running only from old to young. The student had become the teacher, and the teacher was still learning new lessons. Throughout his entire career, Mick Jagger never stopped being a genuine fan of music. Behind the massive legend was simply a devoted listener. These 7 albums weren't just music that he enjoyed. They were mirrors that showed him where he came from and where he still could go. True greatness in art isn't something you're born with fully formed. It's something you borrow from others, bend to your own purposes, and transform into something new and uniquely yours. Mick Jagger understood this truth deeply, and that made him not just a great performer, but a great student of the art form he dedicated his life to mastering.